The name of the paper is Valueless Value, the question of production in Kofan shamanism. In this paper, I try to answer a single question. Can we consider shamanic power to be an embodiment of value if its production bears no direct relation to human action? I engage the issue from the perspective of the indigenous Kofan people of eastern Ecuador, with whom I've been working for more than 20 years. To be sure, the question is an esoteric one, especially if we restrict it to the Kofan case. Like so many other strange questions, it began with an invitation to participate in an American Anthropological Association panel whose topic was only obliquely related to my research interests. In 2017, Matthew Wolfmeyer asked if I'd like to write a paper for a proposed session on value-absent institutions and interactions. Because I'd been working for years to apply theories of value to my ethnographic material, the very idea of trying to understand human life as value-absent was deeply counterintuitive. For scholars aligned with the anthropology of ethics and morality, it's impossible to understand human beings apart from the values that orient their actions. For an anthropologist like me, who joins the concept of values as criteria of action to the idea of value as the quantifiable potentials produced by action, it's even harder to look at human existence and not see value in some form. My attempts to understand Kofan shamanism from the perspective of a value-based approach took a new course during my struggle to squeeze the square peg of my theoretical and ethnographic interests into the round hole of the panel abstract. Like so many ethnographers of the region, I'd always understood Amazonian shamanism to be a morally ambivalent practice. For the Kofan, there's no boundary between shamanic curing and shamanic killing. Simultaneously, a shaman is a wise healer and a capricious murderer. Nonetheless, an ambivalently valued institution is not the same thing as a value-absent institution. After reviewing my notes, I found a possible avenue forward in the writings of the late French ethnologist Pierre Clastre, author of Chronicle of the Guayaquil Indians, Society Against the State, and Archaeology of Violence. In the second book, Clastre writes that, for native societies of lowland South America, political power is equivalent to neither command nor hierarchy. Rather, it's powerless power, a paradoxical phrase that Clastre coins to describe how such peoples experience power as the negative answer to a question posed, rather than as the presence or absence of coercive force. Similarly, I imagined, we could understand Kofan shamanism with the concept of valueless value. According to the idea, the value of the Kofan shaman is not simply a product of Kofan action. Rather, it's a complex representational structure through which Kofan people both realize and deny the value of their religious specialists. In this paper, I use the concept of valueless value to offer a possible answer to the question of the relationship between shamanic value and productive action. Let me state at the outset that I'm not sure I'm on the right path. I have deep theoretical hesitations about Clastre's perspective, and I'm uncertain whether there's any point in extending his insights to either the Kofan case or the conceptualization of value I employ. Nonetheless, I want to give it a try. The worst that can happen is to be told that I'm wrong. Please feel free to do just that. Powerless power. Although there's a resurgence of interest in Clastre's work in French and Brazilian anthropology, his arguments don't appear much in the recent articles and books of North American ethnographers. His mentor was Claude Lévi-Strauss, and his thought owes a clear debt to the structuralist tradition, even though Clastre eventually distanced himself from structuralism. Clastre published perhaps his most important article, Exchange and Power, The Philosophy of the Indian Chieftainship, in 1962, years before he did any fieldwork of his own. In the piece, which was republished in his second book, Clastre provides one of the clearest explanations for why he considers the native peoples of lowland South America to be societies against the state. In the article, Clastre asks an important historical, ethnographic, and political question. Why did the indigenous peoples of lowland South America never develop a state? His answer is that they were keenly aware of the risk of political hierarchy and actively prevented it from arising. Clastre begins his argument with a discussion of the social foundations Lévi-Strauss outlines in the elementary structures of kinship. Lévi-Strauss suggests that societies are built through the exchange of three essential items: words, material goods, and marriage partners. Clastre writes that lowland South Americans position their chiefs at the margins of their societies by restricting their abilities to exchange such objects. In short, Clastra summarizes, chiefs have great oratorical talents, but no one listens to the words they constantly utter. Pressured to be exemplars of material generosity, chiefs give away all their wealth, but receive no goods in return. And, unlike regular community members, chiefs often practice polygyny, with the consequence that they take more wives than they give. If anything, chiefs live in a state of extreme debt because women are consummate values. They're clearly not the equivalents of rhetorical prestations or a few pounds of meat or manioc. As Clastra writes, the chief's multiple wives are a gift with no reciprocation. Taking the total complex into consideration, Clastra argues that there's no exchange in the structure of the lowland South American chieftainship. He concludes that chiefs represent the disruption of reciprocity and the social contract it signs. By refusing exchange with their chiefs, Clastra suggests, lowland South Americans place hierarchy and coercion beyond, rather than within, the social bond. Clastra calls the power represented by lowland South American chiefs powerless power. Rather than the presence or absence of coercive force, such power is the answer to the political question that people repeatedly pose to themselves and answer with an emphatic no. Clastra describes indigenous political philosophy in the language of consciousness and intentionality. He writes that lowland South Americans had an intuition that power is essentially coercion, and that they resolved its threat by representing it in the figure of the powerless chief, thereby both identifying and expelling it from their lives. In the words of the intellectual historian Samuel Moyne, it was a kind of premonitory design that allowed Clastra societies against the state to neutralize the possibility of political authority. Of course, it's easy to argue that Clastra's description of the indigenous stance toward power is one great as-if story. In essence, Clastra distills a systematic philosophy from the abstract features of social structure that he attributes to the whole of lowland South America, despite the cultural diversity of its inhabitants. But it's even easier to slip from the as-if to the is. In his introduction to Clastra's Archaeology of Violence, Eduardo Viveros de Castro embraces the slippage. He writes, quote, "The theme of how to finally take seriously the philosophical choices expressed in primitive social formations returns insistently in Clastra," end quote. Like Clastra, Viveros de Castro makes an argument that is political and ethical as much as it is intellectual. For them, we must respect the thought or philosophy of indigenous South Americans just as we respect the works of Hegel or Rousseau. A major thrust of the neo-structuralist project is to argue for the theoretical sophistication and full capacity for self-reflection of anthropology's traditional subject populations. The point is also a founding principle of the ontological terms call for reflexivity. Rather than rendering their thought through our philosophy, we should allow their philosophy to transform our own concepts and categories. Viveros de Castro is not wholly appreciative of Clastra's theoretical genealogy. He partially attributes Clastra's idea of negating power by representing it to his association with the Parisian group Socialism or Barbarism, which Claude Lefort and Cornelius Castoriadis coordinated through the 1960s. Viveros de Castro suggests that it was the general phenomenological position of this group, in Lefort's words, the preference for understanding the shaping of the lived relations between men, that accounts for Clastra's portrayal of the indigenous chieftainship as an intentional mechanism for preventing the emergence of coercive force. Viveros de Castro qualifies Clastra's phenomenological leanings as metaphysical humanism. He finds a preferable conceptual framework in Clastra's association with Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, two philosophers who challenge the phenomenological tradition. According to Viveros de Castro, the latter's influence can be seen clearly in Clastra's subsequent work on native warfare, which represents a means of acting against the state through the centrifugal war machine rather than the centripetal chieftainship. This operation of the society against the state, according to Viveros de Castro, suffers from none of the political spiritualism that transpires from phenomenological interpretation. It also takes us even further from the understandings of the concrete subjects who populated the societies about whom Clastra wrote. With no impulse to focus analysis on the practice of life as lived, anthropology makes the full transformation from ethnography to ethnology to philosophy. Any claims to representing the complex particularities of indigenous experience have disappeared. a value-based approach. Samuel Moynes suggests that Kloster's work can be interpreted as an attempt to resist and to overcome the well-known communist allegiances of post-war French intellectuals. Kloster was a leftist, but he was also an anarchist. The horror of Stalin lay behind his writing's constant critique of hierarchy, coercion, and totalizing structures. At a time when French Marxist anthropologists were attempting to analyze indigenous societies according to their forces and relations of production, Kloster did his best to forge a different path. His dismissals of his peers' work were anything but kind or subtle. In his essay, Marxists and Their Anthropology, which was republished in Archaeology of Violence, Kloster discusses the writings of such scholars as Claude Meillassoux and Maurice Godelier with brutal mockery. Quote, "The graceful minuet of the structuralists, politely dismissed, is replaced by a new ballet, that of the Marxists, as they call themselves. They do a robust folk dance in their big studded clogs, stomping clumsily on the ground of research. For various reasons, political and not scientific, the public applauds." End quote. Kloster's explicit anti-Marxism might make it seem unwise to connect his insights to any production-based perspective. Yet through my focus on value, I attempt to do just that. Before giving content to the concept of valueless value, I want to lay out the general aspects of what I call a value-based approach. It partially depends on extending Marx's analysis of value in capitalist society to the operation of value in non-capitalist social formations, but it introduces insights from other theoretical traditions as well. Perhaps most troubling to a scholar like Viveros de Castro, it advises situating analysis at the level of the actor as she negotiates the context and relations that compose her life. In this sense, its spirit is close to the phenomenological influences that Viveros de Castro laments in Kloster's early work. As the anthropology of ethics and morality affirms, human beings are, in Webb Keene's words, inevitably evaluative creatures. As we live our lives, we constantly confront situations that demand some form of choice or decision. The criteria, standards, and ideals we rely on to make such decisions are our values. As many anthropologists and philosophers admit, though, we're not purely intentional beings, constantly weighing the desirability of certain actions with an unfettered consciousness, an explicit mastery of value standards, or a limitless ability to reflect and deliberate. Nonetheless, practical reason is often at work, as existence forces us to choose one action over another. Practical judgment involves how we begin actions, how we oversee them, and how we end them. As Michael Lambeck writes, quote, "We can distinguish whether practical reasoning produces actions, initial intentions, concluding verdicts, or normative beliefs, and it depends in part on how explicit the reasoning is, when over the course of a given action or within the stream of practice it takes place, and what means exist to intextualize, narrativize, authorize, or objectify the outcomes." End quote. For the purposes of ethnography, I find the most rigorous description of the relevant issues in the work of the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, who convincingly argues for a socially grounded, ideal-based, pluralistic theory of value. In their writings on prototypes, exemplars, and value monism and pluralism, anthropologists such as Carolyn Humphrey, Joel Robbins, and Paul Kochelman operationalize such ideas and prove their ethnographic merit. In much of the preceding work, the question of how values orient action is divorced from the question of how action produces value. The latter issue is the focus of a separate theoretical tradition, which conceptualizes value quantitatively as well as qualitatively. In the writings of such anthropologists as Terence Turner, Nancy Munn, and David Graeber, value refers to the potentials that actions create. Turner explicitly connects his understanding of value to the work of Marx. For Turner and others, including Munn and Graeber, production refers to much more than the creation of material objects. Turner reminds us that in the German ideology, Marx and Engels offer a cross-cultural and trans-historical notion of production as a total process, including the moments of the production of human beings in the family, the production of social relations of cooperation, and the production of new needs as well as the production of the means of material subsistence. The mistake of many Marxist scholars, including the ones Kloster belittles, is to reduce production to its material dimensions alone. According to the expanded notion of production, As values suggest courses for action, they orient our creation of ourselves and each other as socially, materially, and mentally mediated beings. Through our accumulation of physical and mental capacities, our production of a world of objects, and our creation and transformation of social relations, we build our abilities to act in desired ways. Together, these mutually implied concepts, values as criteria for action, and value as the quantifiable potentials created by action, comprise the two components of a value-based approach. The approach suggests that in any time or place, humans are both products and producers. They're outcomes of value-oriented and value-creative actions, and they're generators of their own and each other's value. According to Roy Bhaskar, action is always transformational activity. It works on and with a set of physical, social, and mental materials and conditions that may be more or less attached to human bodies, and it can either reproduce or transform those materials through value-guided practices. An individual's value is simply their enabling position in a socially, physically, and mentally articulated world. The more value they embody or possess, the greater is their potential to act in ways they deem desirable. The ways of life, or social collectivities in which people participate, can be understood as the arenas in which the creation, transformation, and realization of their value occurs. Graeber argues that this idea has a long though implicit history in anthropology. As he writes, cultures were imagined first and foremost as fields for the pursuit of certain forms of value. No matter how old or new the idea, I believe it can help us think more clearly about the kind of value embodied by Kofan shamans, and whether its form or function resemble the powerless power of the chiefs whom Klostra describes. The valueless value of the Kofan shaman. A full account of the structure of Kofan society or the practice of Kofan shamanism is beyond the scope of this paper. I provide more detailed discussions of the issues in a series of articles and books. Here, I attempt to complicate a single idea, that if the Kofan shaman has value, he must be the product of his own and other Kofan people's creative efforts, and those efforts must be directed according to certain concepts of the desirable. In many ways, the shaman is undoubtedly such a being. He, Kofan shamans are almost always male, guides his everyday decisions and overarching life projects according to given criteria of knowledge, strength, and discipline. In their native language of A'ingay, Kofan people call a powerful shaman an Atesecho, one who knows, an Atecho, one who has seen, a Dishacho, one who has emerged, and a Kuraga, which is a transformation of the Quechua term, Kuraka, which originally stood for an indigenous Andean leader who mediated between native followers and external sources of power. Kofan people also call shamans Asetasu'ai, tabooing or abstaining people. They have Ta'itsi Aibo, hard bodies, the violent powers of Tesi, jaguars, and the destructive tendencies of Kukuya, malevolent supernatural beings. As my Kofan collaborators explained to me, shamans sometimes boast of their powers to other shamans in the language of possession, knowledge, and embodiment, saying such things as, quote, "I'm more than you. I know more than you. I know everything, everything. I have everything, everything," end quote. An aspiring shaman acquires their qualities, capacities, and instruments under the tutelage of other shamans, ideally unrelated men and often supernatural experts from neighboring indigenous groups. Beginning his training at a young age, the shamanic apprentice isolates himself from most social interactions to avoid contact with the contaminating power of reproductive blood. He ingests immense quantities of emetics and hallucinogens. He submits himself to the whims of vicious teachers, who are sometimes identified as the true producers of the shaman's growing abilities. They are the ones who endow the aspiring shaman with his powers by causing him to know, causing him to see, and causing him to taboo or abstain. With fortitude and fearlessness, the apprentice obeys the commands of his masters, cleanses his body, and builds relations with a diverse array of supernatural beings. Slowly, he makes allies of non-human agents, learns their languages and ways, and acquires their weapons and skills. Once he's achieved a sufficient level of knowledge and power, the Kofan shaman returns to his community and is recognized for his ability to cure and to kill. In a special house outside the central village, the Yahetsa'o, others come to him to have malevolent objects removed from their bodies and to have stolen life forces returned from their thieves. Often, his curing necessitates attacking and killing the shamans who are responsible for his patient's afflictions. In the Yahetsa'o, the recognition of his co-residents allows him to perform and thereby realize the value he embodies. The shaman can only maintain his powers or acquire new ones if the people he resides with observe a set of prohibitions, involving mainly the food they share with the shaman and the paths they walk on, to prevent his contamination. In all these ways, the Kofan shaman appears to be a perfect embodiment of value. He orients his productive actions to an image of his ideal self. He employs his own efforts and the contributions of other people to acquire a desired set of skills, relations, and objects, and he profits from the labor of his co-residents, who maintain the conditions he needs to thrive, and who realize his value by turning to him for curing and protection. Upon further analysis, however, the value of the Kofan shaman is not so straightforward. Although his fellow villagers recognize his powers, they also despise them. Shamanism requires a violent, aggressive disposition that the majority of Kofan people associate with enmity and otherness. In general, they fear the shaman more than they revere him. In response to the slightest provocation, the shaman sometimes attacks and even kills his co-residents. Behind his back, people call him a crazy, foolish, and vicious idiot. According to their sense of everyday morality, he's the ideal anti-self, not the ideal self. The most powerful shamans sometimes reside alone in remote households, where they remain distant from human contamination. They accumulate their abilities by interacting mainly with non-human agents, who supply some of them with supernatural wives and children. The shaman with whom I've worked most closely has never produced biological offspring. Two of the most powerful shamans alive during my field work, a pair of male and female cousins who lived together on the outskirts of a community in the Andean foothills, never reproduced. Although he's married with 2 children, the youngest shaman I know is widely considered to be gay, or at least more interested in sex with men rather than women. A Euro-American missionary linguist once told me about a Kofan village he visited on the San Miguel River in the 1950s. It was home to multiple shamans who spent much of their time drinking the hallucinogenic brews yahe, Banisteriopsis caapi with various admixtures, and va'u, Brugmansia suaviolens. Because so few of the village's residents had children, the missionary wondered whether the hallucinogens acted as libido suppressants. The vocational choices and social positions of all these shamans make sense. Their accumulation and maintenance of power depends on avoiding reproductive blood, whether from menstruating women or expectant or postpartum parents, including both the mother and the father, as well as their newborn infant. Accomplished shamans may acquire reputations as powerful beings, but many of them never acquire the technonyms, father or mother of X, that, as the primary terms of address and reference for Kofan adults, are the most common indices of full Kofan personhood. In addition to his poverty of this worldly social relations, a shaman's powers are in many ways the results of actions other than his own or other Kofan people's. Apprenticeship is conceptualized as complete submission to human and non-human agents, including the spiritual masters of neighboring indigenous peoples. Shamans sometimes request students despite the hesitations of the students' parents, who often relent because they're afraid of angering shamans. The process of learning is marked by subjugation, privation, and isolation. In a word, capture. While the aspiring shaman is sleeping, non-human masters, who appear as demonic beings or monstrous transformations of ethno-racial others, lodge him in their homes. They impregnate and possess his body with their supernatural clothing, ornaments, and weapons. As they transcend their fears and drink more and more hallucinogens, shamans learn how to converse with spiritual beings, to transform into them, and to use the instruments they offer for purposes of curing and killing. Historically, there was an overlap of shamanic abilities with political leadership. The most renowned leaders had often been captured and trained by enemy others, whether antagonistic indigenous tribes, Capuchin priests, rubber traders, or Ecuadorian and Colombian soldiers. In the possession and under the control of outsiders, future shamans and leaders acquired new sets of linguistic, cultural, and supernatural skills. Many of the individuals who underwent such capture never returned to Kofan society. The few who did were marked by the otherness that had subsumed them. Such otherness was a useful tool for negotiating the violence that has troubled Kofan communities for centuries, but it also made its bearers into untrustworthy, capricious, and arguably non-Kofan beings. Hence the paradoxes of the shaman's value. In many ways, the outcome of his own will and dedication is just as much the product of non-Kofan others. People respect and rely upon the shaman's capacities, but they also fear and despise them. Co-residents use the shaman's curative and defensive powers and thereby allow him to realize his value, but they do so mainly in a house outside the settlement, on the edge of the forest and the margins of everyday social life. In addition, some shamans do not seek such recognition at all, as contact with regular humans represents contamination and a threat to their powers. Even more, the main recognition they desire is from the supernatural beings who've made them their allies. Such others are the sources of the shaman's powers and the targets of his relational projects. Reflecting on the situation in which the Kofan shaman finds himself, we can begin to understand how he embodies a form of valueless value. On the one hand, he represents such efficacious qualities as fearlessness and aggressiveness. On the other, he affirms the relegation of those qualities and the means to acquire them to a denigrated extra-social space. The shaman allows Kofan people to ponder a form of value that they fear, criticize, and deem unworthy of and unrelated to their own labor and aspirations. In short, Kofan people see the shaman and recognize his powers, but they qualify the shaman's abilities as undesirable and even un-Kofan. The last thing most Kofan people want is to exhibit a shaman's characteristics, which threaten the peaceful, stable, and egalitarian life they desire. As I've described elsewhere, the key Kofan term for a desirable existence, opatsi, refers to a valued state of health, energy, satiation, equality, and freedom from conflict, anxiety, need, and oppressive structures. Most Kofan people consider being desirous and capable of an opatsi life to be a central criterion of Kofanness. The existential state can only be achieved at a distance from enemy others in a community of Kofan friends and family members. Opa'ai, opatsi human, is the term that acts as the main antonym for a person who seeks or possesses shamanic power. The principal animal metaphors for an opa'ai are the plump, fertile, social, and unassuming woolly monkeys that are so unfamiliar with enemy otherness that hunters can easily approach and kill them. The key animal metaphor for a shaman is the jaguar that roams alone and is constantly searching for people to confront and consume. The jaguar is more than a metaphor, though. The Kofan believe that many jaguars who attack and kill humans are actually shamans who have emerged in jaguar form to prowl the waking world. Returning to the idea of valueless value, we can conclude that the idea applies to the Kofan shaman in at least 4 ways. First, the term's paradoxical nature is a perfect fit for the shaman's ambivalent status. He's admired and despised, lauded for his defensive and curative abilities, and detested for the violent acts he commits against his co-residents. Second, the term captures the shaman's strange function as an ideal for activity. Although he holds a set of desired powers, he acquires the bulk of them through actions he neither wills, nor initiates, nor controls. They're the products of the non-Kofan others who capture, isolate, command, and form him, independent of his choice or agency. Third, valueless value describes the negligible role that Kofan labor plays in the production of the shaman's capacities. If, as Graeber suggests, value refers to the social importance of a product, or the quotient of a collectivity's energies embodied in any good, then the shaman has virtually none of it. He's made by neither himself nor his Kofan familiars. He represents little of their labor, which they devote primarily to the production of a socio-psychological state that they define in opposition to the shaman's qualities and practices. Fourth, as the expression of a political philosophy, what Klostra really seeks to understand with the concept of powerless power, the Kofan shaman's valueless value represents the violence, enmity, and otherness that constantly threaten a desirable way of life. Although their ambivalent attachments to the shaman offer some hope of protection, Kofan people's dependence on him is a statement about both the world they dream of and the world they inhabit. Unlike Klostra's societies against the state, the Kofan do not conjure what they despise in order to neutralize it. With the shaman and his violence, such a move is impossible. Rather, the shaman represents the unwilled and unavoidable invasion of a predatory cosmos. He comes from violence and speaks to violence. Kofan people's opinion of him reflects their desire for a world without it. Yet Kofan people cannot produce this world, just as they cannot produce agents capable of negotiating the violence that troubles them. In Clyde Kluckhohn's words, the desirability of a purely peaceful life is a utopian value, as it can never be achieved. In short, Kofan people's stance toward the shaman represents their critique of their existential position, their blamelessness in producing it, and their inability to transcend it. Production, exploitation, and power. My identification of the four senses of the Kofan shaman's valueless value depends on bracketing a number of important questions. Although many anthropologists might acknowledge the productive labor performed by non-Kofan teachers and enemies, it might be harder for them to accept the idea of non-human agents as contributors to the shaman's value. Frankly, I'm not sure how to respond to this potential criticism, except to state that Kofan people would not agree with it. Shamans don't operate in other worlds. They operate in this one. Yet they have special powers of perception and communication that allow them to engage beings that are normally invisible to or distant from everyone else, although they're just as real as everyday people. These are the actors who come to the shaman, supply him with instruments and skills, and allow him to become their familiar and ally. If one does not accept the idea of non-human production, it might make more sense to consider the shaman as the main creator of his own capacities. Nonetheless, it's difficult to understand his work as intentional, value-guided action, given that so much of it occurs in the visionary realms of dreams and hallucinations. In such spaces, the shaman's intentionality is maximally circumscribed, at least in comparison to the deliberations he makes in his everyday waking life. Although powerful shamans remain volitional agents, no matter what visionary spaces they inhabit, the states are conceptualized as arenas in which things happen to the shaman just as much as they happen because of him. In addition, my use of a Marxian notion of production might suggest that Kofan shamanism is a form of exploitation. After all, the shaman increases his power by profiting from both the taboo-guided actions and the status-recognizing decisions of other Kofan people. Nonetheless, both the shaman and the people he cures deem the bulk of the energies he embodies to be non-Kofan in origin and nature. They're strange gifts from supernatural agents and enemy others, who produce the shaman's capacities by capturing, possessing, and transforming him. Of course, a more orthodox Marxist might call the realization of such non-Kofan labor by Kofan people a fetishized misrecognition of value's origin. According to this idea, the shaman's value is created by truly Kofan labor, and that value is a fetish because it appears at a time and in a place, a distant house on a dark night, that are removed from the conditions in which it was produced. Consequently, shamanic value's origin in Kofan labor is concealed. I'm not sure how to respond to the idea of shamanic exploitation, which depends directly on the distinction between human and non-human labor. At this point, it's instructive to consider the relationship between the shaman's value and his power. After all, exploitation is related to power. As non-producers extract more and more surplus value, they create a world in which they control the resources that others need, thereby establishing their position of command. Given my ethnographic data, it's hard for me to view the Kofan shaman as an extractor of Kofan surplus value. Nevertheless, he definitely holds power. Or, in Klostra's words, the capacity to exert coercive force upon other Kofan people. Many powerful shamans end up living apart from Kofan people, so they can maintain maximal closeness to their non-human consorts. The ones who don't sometimes take up leadership positions in Kofan societies, Kofan communities, where they can enjoy the comforts of humanity and experience the social consequences of their skills. There, they use their control over the ultimate resource, life itself, to command others to do their bidding. While doing research for my last book on the community of Doreno, People told me about its founding shaman, whom they called their Natsu, chief, leader, master, or owner. The shaman ordered his co-residents to do all sorts of things, stay in the community after his death, marry people they did not want to, and bind an uncooperative man so the shaman could whip him in front of the entire village. If people didn't obey him, they knew that, as a shaman, he would become angry and turn into a demon or jaguar to kill them. So much for Klostra's notion of the powerless Amazonian chief. Yet even the Kofan shaman's power has a strange being. During my dissertation research, I asked many of my collaborators a simple question: who can command other people? They invariably replied, a kuraga, a shaman. The word that allowed me to pose the question was mandaye, the a-inge verb for command. The term is a clear borrowing of the Spanish mandar, which also means to command. To the best of my knowledge, no other lexeme in the Kofan language comes close to signaling the same thing. It's a telling ethnographic fact that in order to identify the operation of coercive force, Kofan people turn to the semantic resources of another language to communicate the idea. A shaman who's become a community leader is definitely accepted as a Kofan person. The command-obedience relationship he manages, however, demonstrates his lasting association with enmity and otherness. From my perspective, it makes sense to consider his position as the outcome of an exchange that differs from the one Klostra discusses in Exchange in Power. Because the defensive powers of the shaman offers are not the products of his co-resident's labor, it might appear as if he is the exploited one. In other words, Kofan people enjoy the fruits of the value the shaman has accumulated, even though they didn't produce it. But in exchange for his curing and protection, they agree to be subjects of his power. The idea of this exchange matches the explanations of Kofan people, who state that although they despise the shaman's violent ways, they choose to reside alongside him because the alternative of living on their own offers a more certain path to sickness, injury, and death. Returning to the idea of the lowland South American chief's powerless power, the Kofan shaman represents a different dynamic. As a leader, one of the shaman's two possible paths, he truly does command. But the goods he gives are neither words nor material tokens, nor does he take extra wives. Indeed, he sometimes takes none. Rather, the objects he offers are curing and protection, and the ones he receives are obedience and fair. The fact that Kofan people have to accept the bargain at all reflects their understanding of their inescapable position in a violent cosmos, which constantly crashes into their lives. For them, freedom and equality are impossible to achieve. Perhaps they share the dream of Klostra's societies against the state, but they've never inhabited a world where such a dream could become a reality, and they doubt they ever will. Conclusion. In this paper, I took inspiration from Klostra's concept of powerless power to propose the idea of the Kofan shaman's valueless value. In doing so, I accepted a theoretical position that differs from that of Klostra and other scholars working within a structuralist tradition. Rather than rely on an as-if story that distills a coherent philosophy from abstract features of social and cultural structure, I restricted my analysis to the practices and understandings of Kofan people as they negotiate the actors, relations, and situations that compose their lives. A value-based approach allowed me to do so. Such a perspective directs analysis to both the criteria that orient Kofan people's actions and the potentials their actions produce. The theoretical position enabled my description of the four senses of the Kofan shaman's valueless value: his morally ambivalent status, his non-volitional accumulation of powers, his embodiment of capacities produced by non-Kofan labor, and his representation of a utopian desire, the dream of a life free from violence and coercion. My main goal was not to argue against Klostra's empirical conclusions regarding the powerless power of lowland South American chiefs, although my analysis did generate a contrasting portrayal of Kofan political relations. Rather, I intended my description of the Kofan shaman's position to demonstrate the productivity of a value-based approach and the concept of valueless value I derive from it. My conclusions reflect the arguments of other Amazonianist anthropologists, including the ethnographers who describe the morally ambivalent aspects of Amazonian shamanism and the convivial ideals of many Amazonian societies. With regard to the latter, My findings support Joanna Overing and Alain Passace's argument that we should focus analysis on the moral aesthetics of everyday practice in order to understand how Amazonian peoples balance love and anger or peace and violence in their lives. Nonetheless, Overing and Passace's portrayal is too optimistic for the Kofan, as Kofan people do not view compassion as an instrument capable of mitigating the violence and coercion of a vicious cosmos. They constantly experience such lamentable forces, whether directly in their brute power or indirectly through the figure and mediation of the shaman. When I sent my original AAA paper to a Brazilian colleague who identifies with the neo-structuralist tradition, he praised my argument but offered two criticisms. First, he wrote, the difference between power and value is not that clear. He wasn't convinced I was doing anything more than confirming Kloster's insights, or perhaps using them as a foil. Second, he urged me to situate my analysis more firmly in the regional literature to demonstrate how it is filtered by what we know from Amazonian ethnology. In another note, he wrote, quote, you seem to spontaneously shift from social theory to the Kofan and vice versa without passing through the sieve that makes this move possible, that contextualizes it, gives it meaning, makes it ring, the huge body of ethnographic work on Amazonian societies. In Levi-Straussian terms, it's the move from ethnography to anthropology that bypasses ethnology. In this way, it sometimes seems like what you're saying is completely sui generis, when really it is the lot of Amazonian societies, end quote. My colleague's claim has merit. In fact, it's true. Although I've read much of the Amazonianist literature, my main goal in this paper was to bring a relatively universal conceptual apparatus, the value-based approach, to my ethnographic material in order to analyze that material and demonstrate the utility of the theoretical perspective I employ. The key anthropological interlocutors who allowed me to do so were such value-focused scholars as Terence Turner, Nancy Munn, and David Graeber, whose interests extend from Amazonia to Melanesia, Africa, and the contemporary political movements of non-indigenous North Americans and Europeans. The meaning I seek is in the coherence of the lives and perspectives of my Kofan collaborators. I certainly didn't intend to flesh out one more variation on a broader Amazonian theme, a structuralist directive I've questioned elsewhere. If other Amazonians detect similarities between my description of the Kofan case and their own ethnographic material, it's because those similarities are objectively there, not because I use synthetic portrayals of Amerindian attributes to guide my assumptions, methods, and findings. I do realize that some Amazonianists will criticize me for ignoring the content of the work of a number of anthropologists whose publications are central, or at least relevant, to my argument. Although my account of the Kofan shaman's valueless value might seem isolated from the comparative context of Amazonian ethnology, it builds on many works in the anthropology of value, a distinct theoretical tradition with its own principles. The approach's phenomenological dedication to understanding how situated actors create and negotiate the conditions of their lives, as well as its openness to admitting the pragmatic complexities and uncertainties of action, make a difference in ethnographic analysis. Luis Costa and Carlos Fausto state that much of the contemporary work on indigenous Amazonia reflects a defining element of classical structuralism, a privileging of the order of concepts over the order of practice. A value-based approach reverses the privileging. The only conceptual orders it acknowledges are the ones revealed by attending to its subjects' context-enabled forms of discourse and practice. The empirical consequences can be seen in ethnographic accounts, ranging from Bourdieu's analysis of parallel cousin Kabyle marriage to my own examinations of the affective, epistemological, and ontological dimensions of the experience of capture and the status of myth in Kofan life. A value-based approach highlights empirical complexity, experiential uncertainty, and cultural particularity. It doesn't minimize them or merge them into regional representations. Perhaps that's why the paradoxical notion of valueless value is so appealing to me. Whether it fits the ethnographic data of other anthropologists is beside the point. I only presume to speak about Kofan people and the complexly Kofan shamans who inhabit the centers and margins of Kofan life. From my perspective, such an investigation is a value unto itself. Thank you.